Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for attending our book discussion with my colleague Sarah Peterson Dryden. We will give a few more minutes for participants to join, and then we would start the book discussion. Thank you very much. Okay, hello again. So welcome everyone to our, what I think would be a very exciting and much needed discussion and reflection on education of refugee children. I'm pleased to be joined with my colleague, Sarah, who has written an exhaustive and interesting book of summing up a long journey and research into the education of refugee children. It's amazing, Sarah, to be able to cover so many different contexts and over a very significant period of time where the field has really kind of started to emerge. So I'm looking forward to to the discussion of your book. We will start first with a presentation. So Sarah will give a presentation of around 20 minutes on her book, and then we will open the space for discussion. Please, if you have any questions, type your question in the Q&A, and we will try to take as many questions as possible, as much as the time allows. Sarah, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Maha. And it's just really delightful to be here today. As Maha just said, I think we're really looking forward to the discussion and to thinking together about the field of refugee education, in some ways kind of taking stock of where we are, and most importantly, really envisioning where the future of this field is going. I will talk for about 20 minutes now about some of what I've learned through this book, Right Where We Belong, and then we'll dive into discussion. You're welcome to use the Q&A during the time when I'm talking to, if things occur to you, so that we can keep track of questions along the way. This question that you see on the center of your screen is really the one that drives this book. What would it take to ensure that all displaced young people have access to learning that enables them to feel a sense of belonging and prepares them to help build more peaceful and equitable futures? Oh, sorry, there we go. The topic areas of the book I've put in the quadrants here, and these are the topics that the book addresses and the research that it draws from. In the book, as Maha alluded to, I've really tried to bring together studies rather than looking independently at different places at different time periods. So it includes 9 discrete research studies, including 15 years of ethnographic research in schools and more than 600 interviews in 23 countries. I'm going to begin today with some context and a summary of how I hope some of what I think we're learning from refugee teachers and students can shift this field of refugee education in ways that address rampant inequities and expand opportunities. Today, 58 million children remain out of school habitually, globally, and this represents massive progress, down from 99 million in 2000. But when we ask who is left out, we see that it is mostly children who live in conflict and in displacement. In terms of learning, we know that there are massive inequities globally in access to even foundational reading and numeracy skills. Some of our work in Kenya has documented early grade literacy outcomes among refugees to be some of the lowest in the world. And I'll talk today about important ways in which refugees experience exclusion also from languages, from curricula, and from relationships with teachers and with peers. Access to education and to learning, in theory, enable opportunity, but we also know that opportunities are tied to structures, including legal, social, and political conditions, and of course, to power. In almost all countries where refugees live, they're non-citizens, likely never citizens, conditions that really limit their access to equitable educational and post-schooling opportunities, especially since they have limited rights to education, to work, to movement, to capital, and to long-term residence. Some of you are very familiar with settings of refugee education, yet I imagine some of you are not. And I think it's important to see people and not just words on a screen. All of the photos that I share today were taken and they are shared with permission. This is a typical classroom in a refugee camp in terms of the number of students and the infrastructure. 30% of refugees globally live in Africa. This is standard 1 in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya in 2018. But of course, there's wide variation in refugee education globally as well. Not all refugees live in camps like Kakuma. In fact, more than 60% of refugees live in cities. And this is a grade 9 class of Syrian students in Beirut, Lebanon in 2019. These Syrian students and those in Kakuma are some of the now almost 27 million refugees globally. This number of refugees has grown since World War II, and it continues to grow by almost 7 million people in the last 6 months. We expect these numbers to increase further with climate change and political instability globally. Importantly, where refugees live is not equally distributed globally. So the UN High Commissioner for Refugees reports that 73% of refugees live in neighboring host countries. So Syrians primarily in Turkey and Lebanon, Congolese in Uganda, and 86% of refugees live in countries classified as low and middle income countries, with fewer resources for social services such as education. For comparison, in 2017, 25% of the population in Lebanon was a refugee, and that compares to less than 0.1% in the United States, which is now where I live. In 2019, only 1,198 refugees from Afghanistan were admitted to the US, while almost 1.5 million Afghan refugees continued to live in Pakistan, many for more than 20 years. 20 years. And I argue in the book that this long-term displacement is really a central dimension of refugee education. Once displaced, 80% of refugees are displaced for at least 5 years and 20% for over 20 years, which is 3 times as long as it was in the early 1990s. This length of displacement means that exile is the one and only chance that refugee children have for an education. Abrun, who was one of our research participants in Kenya, thought he would quickly return to Somalia after he fled with his family. But 21 years later, he was still in Kenya. This expectation of short-term displacement, but the reality of long-term displacement, is present for individual refugees like Abrun, and also for agencies making refugee policy. Dilemmas of access, learning, and opportunity, these geographies of where refugees live, and their long-term, often lifetime displacement, present urgent sets of policy and practice challenges in the field of education broadly, ones that I think demand the building of new frameworks for thinking and for action. So here we are back at this slide with the quadrants and trying to really see interrelationships among these dilemmas across the arc of the book. In a nutshell, what I see is that out of the history of refugee education, we emerge right now in a moment where refugees have new, but not complete, access to national schools. And yet, in studying the purposes of education for refugees and how they are understood across country contexts, we see multiple models of schooling and challenges in how access to national schools does not translate into learning for refugee students, that access is necessary, but of course not sufficient. As I began then to look closely at the kinds of resources that could support learning and belonging for refugee students, our research has focused on previously undocumented transnational relationships that shape what and how refugee young people learn. Out of this work, we've come to new questions about how access and learning do connect to opportunities for young people to build their futures in settings of massive restrictions on social, economic, and political rights. And new findings on how students and teachers together navigate these inequities in order to expand individual and collective opportunity. I discuss in the book how I think these types of reformulation come through both the substance of the research that we do, but also how we do our research, the methods that we use, and the conceptual weaving across fields that's required. And I'm very happy to talk more about methods and conceptual work in the discussion. I thought during the presentation, though, I would summarize some of the substantive reformulations. When I began my research in this field, alongside many of you who I see here today, the prevailing view among global and national organizations and in early, mostly agency-conducted research was that education for refugees was a kind of holding ground, really designed to create a more stable present, but to defer the creation of a future. Most refugees had access to education only in separate schools for refugees, isolated from national education systems, and with the intention of providing temporary schooling with short-term goals. I was struck by how little this approach aligned with both the long-term nature of displacement and also the kinds of education I observed refugee communities creating for their children in terms of building connections to national education systems, but also to purposes aligned to futures that they imagined that were in the context of politics and of conflict in their home countries and their host countries, clearly oriented towards long-term future goals. In the book, I examine the history of refugee education to understand how we got to the place we are now, which is an era I call nationalization, where by policy, refugees largely have access to national education systems. This quite radical shift in global policy to include refugees in national education systems led me to questions about the purposes of education. The new idea, the new movement to include refugees in national education systems really rested on the idea that this inclusion would address what refugee agencies, refugee individuals had described as a kind of unknowable future, that it would provide the kind of educational stability and quality that was actually needed in long-term displacement. That line of thinking really followed from the idea that the purposes of education within national education systems would, or at least could, align for nationals and for refugees. But what we have found is not one, but multiple models of inclusion of refugees in national education systems. And we found that these models actually reflect the purposes of education for refugees that diverge from purposes for nationals. In particular, that the models align with the futures that policymakers, usually political policymakers, envision for refugees, being elsewhere. Overall, we find evidence of structural integration, making national education available to refugee young people, but very little attention to the relational integration processes that undergird learning, belonging, and opportunity. In schools and in classrooms, what this means is that teachers and students feel a lack of alignment with what they thought inclusion in national schools would mean and what they actually experience. Along these lines, I wanted to tell you about Annette, who is a participant in our research and also a protagonist of the book. This is a drawing that she made. When Annette arrived in Uganda, she thought that her exile in the refugee camp where she lived would be short-lived, that she would soon return to her home in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. But one day she looked through the door to her family's home in the camp, and she noticed that her father had planted bananas. Bananas can take up to a year to produce fruit, and she knew that he would never have planted them if he expected the family to soon return home. At school, Annette sat at the back of a class of 49 children. She was never called on to speak in class. Her teachers rarely had the chance to look at her exercise books, and she never interacted with her teachers outside of the classroom. Annette described how the national students in her class refused to sit with refugee children. Nationals set 2 children to a bench, and refugees set 4 children to a bench. and they knew that they couldn't move to even out these numbers. Yet despite what children experienced, a Ugandan NGO worker in the camp explained the rationale for not collecting data on ethnicity. She said, when they come here, we ask them not to be their nationalities anymore. Instead, each day Annette stood in front of the Ugandan flag in the school's compound. On the drawing, you can see right in the middle, the flag that she drew before she told me how she felt about this flag in an interview. She sang the national anthem, "O Uganda, the land of freedom, O Uganda, the land that feeds us." I had watched Annette sing loudly when she arrived at this next line, "We lay our future in thy hand." Yet as she laid her future in the hands of the state, she soon came to realize that her future could not be of this state. For the next 5 years after I met her, Annette continued to go to school every day. When she stopped at the age of 18, she was not allowed to vote. She was not allowed to own property. And since she didn't have the right to work, she wouldn't be able to practice as a nurse, which is what she had once dreamed about. Instead, she still lived in the same refugee camp and was a subsistence farmer who tended, among many other crops, her family's bananas. I came to ask, what is the value of including refugees in schools that are already failing national students? And even in a best case scenario where refugees are able to access high quality education within national education systems, what of these unequal opportunity structures that limit their futures? So what are the possibilities of learning and belonging towards opportunity? What I describe in the book, I think, counters two ideas that still prevail. First, that refugees are reliant on international humanitarian aid structures for educational success. And second, that few educational supports are accessible in refugee communities. We also document ties between diaspora and countries of origin, a kind of transnational movement of educational resources. We find that refugees draw on both locally and globally situated resources for their education through transnational relationships with diaspora, particularly with former teachers. We also find that these transnational relationships and experiences shift what refugee students learn, really reformulating Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems model that I find so dominates thinking in education to really think about 21st century phenomenon of migration and communication, the kinds of transnational lives that refugee young people are living both in reality and in aspiration. In the book, I emphasize the value not only of material resources, which have been the focus of humanitarian assistance in education, but also the substance of these resources, the substance of learning and its meaning for now and for the future. These emerging patterns, in particular how teachers and community leaders with refugee backgrounds were not only providing resources, but also re-envisioning what and how refugee children learn, led to more conceptual thinking about the ways in which refugee education can act on the inequalities that we observe in access and in learning in order to expand opportunities. Long-term work in many places documented in this book and work by many of you, I think shows that refugee experiences of forced displacement and migration result in a kind of constant navigation of this triangle that you see on the slides, connecting histories to the dual imperative of living in the place one is from the very moment of arrival, this idea of placemaking, while also connecting that placemaking to future building involving imagining and planning for multiple possible futures, here, there, somewhere else entirely, processes that, unlike migration policies, are not linear and not seeking some arrived at state. But of course, there are massive legal, political, and xenophobic constraints on refugees' access to resources and to opportunities, both for placemaking and for future building. And at the same time, I find that refugee young people and their families describe how education can support navigating these barriers, particularly the misalignment between schooling in the present and opportunities in the future. I want to situate thinking about this navigation among past, present, and future in a few ideas that I've been inspired in collaborative thinking with many colleagues, including some of you. One is negative and positive peace. Johann Galtung, drawing on earlier work of Martin Luther King Jr., describes the difference between negative peace, the absence of direct violence, and positive peace, the absence of structural violence. So positive peace is not only the absence of violence, but the actual presence of conditions that allow individuals and communities to access equal opportunities. Refugee education, I argue, has typically been framed with the goal of negative peace. We see this in the historical work with refugee education as a temporary holding ground to keep people safe until return is possible. And more recently, in different models of inclusion of refugees in national education systems that support access, but without accompanying conditions for learning, for belonging, and for opportunity. The social theorist Nancy Fraser outlines how access to equal opportunities requires both redistribution to counter resource-based inequalities and recognition to counter identity-based inequalities. In education, redistribution to address resource-based inequalities often happens through systems-level policies, as we see in the case of policies to include refugees in national education systems. But as we see in the growing work in the field of refugee education, addressing identity-based inequalities can be much more challenging to institutionalize, especially in settings where refugees do not have access to rights, and the national narratives of belonging that they encounter inside and outside of school simply don't include them. I began to ask if disrupting identity-based inequalities could be compatible with any kind of inclusion model of refugee education. What I find in Right Where We Belong is that possibilities of disrupting these inequalities may be connected to perceptions of refugees' futures. From research with refugee students across contexts, we see that they largely reject the notion that they can conceptualize their futures geographically and in terms of countries, which is how migration policies and education policies are conceptualized. While young people wish for more geographic certainty and more inclusive migration policies are absolutely essential, young people also pragmatically describe how little control they have over these kinds of policies. I think what we've learned from young people is a different way to conceptualize futures in education, and thus the purposes and experiences of education in terms of opportunities. So the capacity to apply what one learns across place and over time, not having to choose between the present and the future, between the kinds of learning that are deemed worthy within the education one might experience at the present in this particular geography, and the opportunities that then one might trade away for a different kind of future. This framework relies less on education as bounded by geography and more on education as an enabler of opportunity. I think it's a shift away from a narrow focus on negative peace and on resources as the framework for thinking and action in refugee education, and instead points us to a new focus to try to identify mechanisms by which refugee education can act on both resource and identity-based inequalities to work towards positive peace, including equitable opportunities. I think there's a kind of hopefulness in these ideas that runs quite counter to what I find most written about refugees. And I share this hope because I think it derives from the people who do the work of refugee education daily, teachers and young people. I often find that their hope is based not in ignoring reality, but instead in being so deeply engaged with it, experiencing inequalities at every turn, and therefore considering replicating this status quo of negative peace as really no option at all. To live up to these goals, we still have a long way to go. And I talk about some openings for opportunities to do this in the book. I'm excited now for our discussion together and for ongoing collaborations that I hope will continue to help build greater understanding of the processes that do enable learning and belonging for refugee young people globally, and also how we might redesign our policies and our institutions to equitably reflect these goals. With thanks to so many in this work, I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Such a rich presentation, and I first want to ask everyone to share their questions. And meanwhile, I would like to share some reflections that I had, and I'm glad that we have the chance to discuss those. I have to say, when I read the book, Sarah, I was like, in some ways, it's not what I expected. I expected more of what you're the kind of like discourse that you're doing now, and a less narrative. So I wanted to ask, I was curious, why did you choose to represent this wealth of data and experience in the form of stories, which were very, it's much easier to relate to in many ways. But I was just interested, as a scholar of education of refugee children, why did you decide to go for that approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such a great question, maybe not only about this book, but also for those of us who are researchers and situated in universities as we think about who our audiences are and how we want to communicate our work. And this was a very conscious decision that I made. I wanted to write a book that I felt could reach an audience that might not yet think they would be interested in refugee education, for example, as well as those who knew that they would be interested. And I think one of the things, or 2 points on this, I think one of the things that I have found is that when I have worked in the realm of refugee policy, for example, and worked to think about strategies in countries or at a global level, I've often found what's missing from those conversations is attention to what the daily and monthly and yearly schooling experiences of children and families really is within whatever kinds of policies are created. And given the work that myself and our team have done over time and over many years, I felt like we were in a unique position to try to inform some of the thinking, both in terms of research and in terms of policy, about what it really means to go to school every day, not knowing if your legal status would be secure the next day, or what it means to find yourself in a classroom where the history that you're being taught doesn't represent your own experience or your own identity. And not only what that means today, but what that means 5, 10 years down the road as we try to follow individuals over time. And so I think that really thinking about the longitudinal nature of those experiences and the deeply contextual experiences in classrooms and communities was a real motivation for that. I also wanted to make a kind of larger point that I think we often put these kind of boundaries around research studies that in fact reinforce the challenges of inequities in education to begin with. And by that, I mean, we look at education in a particular place, in one refugee camp or in one school serving refugees in a city or in one country. And that, I think, ignores this very deep transnational reality that young people experience, whether that's through mobile communication, through their reading of media, through interactions with family, or the kinds of aspirations. And so without looking across contexts, I think we miss the bigger picture of what education for refugees might actually be for, what the purposes are, which is this much broader sense of cognitive mobility and real development of learning and belonging over time, which doesn't need to be geographically specific. And I thought that narrative across these different spaces could support all of us to really think about both what some of the common experiences might be, but also what some of these contextual differences might be.
Thank you. Okay, this, I mean, for me, I think why it was different from what I expected in a sense is because your early work was, I mean, you were one of the first who helped UNHCR to start to draft their thinking and strategy around education of refugee children. And this is why I thought, okay, this probably, Sarah's book is going to be speaking more to policy makers. So I think it's interesting how, and I could see why you chose not to. But if we want to reflect on your, the report that you drafted with UNHCR over 11 years ago, and I think you rightly in your book say there's this field, okay? I think we can say now there is an emergence of a new field. I mean, I don't know how new it is, but there's a field here. And in that report, you outline 7 challenges. If if you would reflect now, 10 or 11 years later, where do you see the main challenges are? And where are the main solutions? I mean, you're now pushing beyond this, or you're highlighting the limitations of standardized educational provisions for a population on the move, particularly when you don't have the same legal rights as the citizens of this nation. So what would you outline are the main challenges, but also the, like, if you were to recommend for policymakers, in which direction would you, write 10 years later this report?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure I can come up with 7 right now, but I think
no, not 7. It could be any. Yes.
Yeah. Right. That's what it was then. I think that I think that one of the main challenges remains and has become more visible, real attention to actual processes of teaching and learning. So when I drafted that report in 2011, really the sole focus was on trying to ensure that there were physical school buildings that refugees could go to and teachers who would be teaching, and limiting the number of students in each class. And I think that it is more than past time for us to be really paying attention to what that means to learn in a classroom that is newly reconstituted with longtime residents and newcomers, and what teachers need in order to be able to do that work well. So I think that the kind of macro level challenge is really focusing in on the teaching and learning processes, and towards goals both of learning, but also of belonging. And so this idea that that we've looked at in Lebanon, and I know that you have as well, of what does it mean for students to learn in order to pass a high stakes exam, can be one thing. And that is an incredibly important goal that students describe in order to have access to further education. But accompanying that, really thinking about what learning for a longer term future looks like. What is the kind of learning that students can take with them to the different places, the different settings, the different job opportunities, the different kinds of lives that they want to build, the civic engagement they want to be involved in. And part of that is really connected to the sense of belonging. How do I become enough a part of a community that I can see myself contributing? And I think these are some of the hardest questions for education to address, not only for refugees, but also for nationals. But I think that's the major challenge, is really focusing in on the teaching and learning processes. And I guess just related to that, I was going to say that I think this connects also to the kinds of both rhetoric and action we see within many countries that are really limiting in terms of what a national identity might be, or what a political space for dialogue includes. And I think as we observe and understand from refugee young people, when the space for discussion of really complicated questions about what it means to live together, how to distribute resources, what's fair, how to think about social policy are completely closed for discussion, that those spaces for actually learning and for belonging that could result in students feeling like they're able to contribute and build a new society start to dwindle as well. And again, I think these are not only questions in refugee education, but in education more broadly.
I'm going to come to this point, the last point, but then would you say, I mean, 11 years later, would you then call for more global frameworks or global educational system? I mean, there have been attempts by some UN agencies and another thing, Cambridge Assessment and UNICEF tried to do the global curriculum. I'm not sure exactly what's the name. Maybe my colleague Ricardo could tell her. I think it's Passport. I can't remember now the exact title. But would you then say global frameworks might be a potential alternative, or maybe an option?
Right. I mean, I don't think that there is one answer to this. I think that there are important ways, and refugee students will say this in many different contexts, that we need to think about what kind of learning is recognized, kind of is possible to credential across borders. But I think what we often see with these kind of global and standardized approaches is that really dilutes the kind of learning that students are looking to do. And so if the kind of learning that is possible to accredit across contexts is really about reading and math, but the political dimensions of engaging in some of the questions around history and literature and civics is too complicated and those things get left out, I think we really truncate the kinds of learning opportunities that young people are seeking. So I do think it's a both and. I think we want to think about the ways in which credentials and learning can be recognized across borders, but also really pay deeply and close attention to the contextual learning that young people are doing in each particular context, which may be a country, which may be a city, which may be a school, which is often where the deeper learning really happens.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to bring your last point when you said, and this applies to any other educational system. And I think this is a very important point that I often, think about. Is the education of refugee different from any other disadvantaged groups? And I want to come to my colleague, Professor Ricardo. And Ricardo, your question is there, but if I may invite you to ask your question, if that's okay, because I think it's always nicer to, so I'm gonna give you the ability to talk, because it's always nicer for us to have a more interactive discussion. So Ricardo, if you wish to ask your question, but also I know that you work in context not of refugee, but also of a very marginalized and disadvantaged population in conflict-affected societies in different parts of Africa, particularly Ethiopia. So Ricardo, over to you if you want to ask a question, but also if you can make linkages between, do you find what we're battling here with is relevant also to your context, even if these children don't have a refugee status?
Thank you, Maha. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And Sarah, it's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for allowing me to speak. And I'm really speaking on behalf of my doctoral student, B. Simpson, who is actually the one that is driving this result, which is the one driving us to ask this question. So we collaborate with Professor Goretti in Uganda. So she's leading the USO, and you probably know the citizen-led assessments. And they have their refugee study, and by the smiles, probably I know that you're very aware of her study, which was very much focused on refugee areas. And B is trying to understand access and to early childhood education by refugees, children of who are of refugee families, and then compared to similar households. That's what Maha is saying, similar households or households that live in these areas of where are of high concentrations of refugees, which is a much closer comparison with our quantitative methods, which is what I use in terms of trying to make these comparisons. And actually we were quite surprised because, and these tallies with some of the numbers that we look from other reports, that is nearly 46 or 47% of children of refugee families are accessing or had access to early childhood education, but it's about only 26% of the comparable population in this area. And again, we're then linking this to further on in their educational trajectories to some learning that were done, learning assessments, basic learning assessments with the USO data later on. And again, we found much higher results for refugee children, which is a little bit, again, some of the narratives that you were describing. Not to say that within the, compared to the broad population, they're much more at the disadvantage. So that is something that is puzzling us, and we're grappling. So I think my questions were, one is whether you were aware of this result, and the other is, how would you suggest that quantitative researchers kind of put forward much more critical analysis, or which kind of critical quantitative studies we need to take in order to engage deeply in this context, because potentially we are also part of the problem in terms of how do we position the numbers and how do we put these numbers, and how these numbers may not go with the very deep narratives that your study and Maha's studies and others that we have are actually sharing very deep lights about what it is to be in the classroom as a refugee child, as you were explaining, when these children are sitting, in the same classroom, but they're not there. It's like the invisibility of their experience, which also is shared in context such as Ethiopia and other contexts of where conflict is prevailing. But I'll stop there because we're here to hear from you, and thank you for letting me provide a little bit of a longer narrative. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo.
Oh, thanks so much, Ricardo. It's great to hear about this work. Dr. Goretti Nakabugo and I were close colleagues at the University of Cape Town, where we studied together about 25 years ago. And I followed with interest her work with Uwezo as well. I think that two things, I guess. To me, this result is not puzzling. I think we often see that, particularly for targeted programs, that and particularly in rural areas, that refugees can often have greater access to some of these social services than nationals. And I think there are lots of reasons for which this could be. I don't think that we necessarily have the answer, but certainly some of what we've seen in Kenya in connection to Kakuma refugee camp, for example, is that that when an area is defined and when resources are brought from multiple places, that it can be more straightforward to really think about what that program looks like and who to include, and to increase the number of resources and access in that way, so that refugees living in Kakuma may have greater access to education than those Kenyan nationals living in the surrounding areas, for whom resources may be more limited to one source, or the population may be more dispersed. So this might be something to think about too, in terms of this kind of investment in the programs. And I don't know a lot about early childhood programs in Uganda, but I think that one of the lessons from some of these other contexts in which we've worked is just how important it is to think about coordination between services for refugees and services for nationals, because often people are actually living in the same place and are seeking the same kinds of resources, and bringing those together can be more efficient. I think where we run into challenges is where actually the direction of those services might go differently. If families are looking for different kind of education or looking for different kind of early childhood programming. This question about different kinds of methodologies for doing this work, I am a firm believer in mixed methods. I think that we learn the best and the most when we really try to align our methods with the research questions that we have. I do think that particularly when results are puzzling in this way, that using more than one method to trying to get at the question can be really important. This was a situation that we've had recently. We were doing a study of choice of language of instruction in Kakuma refugee camp, and looking at early learning, early literacy outcomes for children when they received instruction in English only or in English and Kiswahili. And so this was a randomized controlled trial, and we have quantitative results on this, but we also did a deep interview study, deeply constructivist kind of interview study, and interviewing teachers, children, and parents to try to learn about why they had different language choices. And I was fully convinced going into this study that refugee children and families would say they did not want to learn Kiswahili in this context of Kakuma, because I had heard from older students how hard it was and how limiting it felt to their progress in school. And yet what we found was really that in looking at the quantitative results and the qualitative results together, this different meaning behind different language choices. So English for the future and Kiswahili for the kind of getting by in the present. And if we had used either of these methods alone, we would have come to very different kinds of conclusions about a policy related to language of instruction. And yet in trying to bring them together to really see the different nuances that valued both the learning outcomes and the preferences and goals and experiences and aspirations of the individuals experiencing that. So I just give that example as one way in which I think that the more collaboration that we can have among those of us who use different methods and bringing them together to trying to answer these questions that are really hard to answer in any single study using any single method.
Thank you, Sarah. I have a related question about, research, but also knowledge production in this field. But first, I'm going to Masa and Soha Totunji. I don't know if any of you is able to speak. I've asked you if you would like to, but both Masa and Soha are heavily involved in education of refugee, having run programs for refugee children. So both are the question is about the negative piece. So I was saying that what we have in Lebanon is negative piece, and Masa, so how would we get out of that? But also Masa is highlighting how could we move to positive peace within the constraints of the political and politicized challenges of the refugee education, but particularly as they are pushed more and more into the national educational system of host countries, where they are enrolled in kind of like a, how to say, like on a less, more compromised position. So over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, no, thanks for these questions, and I think it connects to Suha's question there as well. As you're saying, I think that we can't move towards positive peace without addressing these kind of political and politicized challenges and the kinds of like you just said, Maha, the kind of compromised positions in which refugees often find themselves. And I think that is part of this kind of overarching challenge that I see in refugee education. Whereas kind of in the past, if we're thinking only about access or counting teachers and students or how many students to a bench, we really can, I mean, not fully, as we saw in the example of Annette, but kind of depoliticize some of that. But if we're deeply focused on teaching and learning processes in classrooms, then that it is essential to engage with the politics of what students are living, as well as the politics of curriculum at national level or at school level, depending on where those decisions are made. And obviously, this is incredibly challenging to do and can be heightened in contexts where refugee education is taking place. But I think that those are the challenges that we have to address, because without addressing those political questions of what is taught and how is it learned and how do we think about big challenging issues in the classroom, and then also connecting that to the kinds of opportunities that are or are not available to refugees once they finish school, only then can we actually connect learning in school to opportunities that young people imagine that learning in school will create. I think that one of the things that has become ever more apparent in refugee education over the past decade, as more refugee young people are included in national systems and graduate from secondary schools, is that as this kind of false promise of what that education means. So graduating into what? Many of our research participants will talk about this kind of all of a sudden realizing that they are going to wake up with all the education that they had ever been told they needed to do the kinds of things that they wanted to do, only to be told that they don't have the right to leave the camp where they're living, or they don't have the right to matriculate at the university that actually sits next to the school that they went to in a city, that they don't have the right to get a job because they don't have legal status, that they're not able to civically or politically engage because that could land them in detention. And I think that teachers really seeing it as an important part of learning to support young people to understand what those realities are and to begin in small ways to try to think about how they shift them through their own individual actions and through collective actions is an essential part of education.
But is that feasible within the fact, I mean, as you point out in the book, this is a field that's been grown very close to humanitarian agencies, which is apolitical. And in some ways, I mean, much of what we found out now about education of refugees, we've already knew it in some ways, but with the UNRWA Palestinian refugee children in UNRWA schools who after 70 years are being integrated within the educational system, but denied legal rights of work, movement, etc., or political participation, their education has been, as a result, to no use. So, I mean, are you hopeful that we can be more political or address these political issues, particularly as the actors are humanitarian agencies who have to at least claim to be meaningful?
I mean, I think the stakes are too high not to be hopeful, but I think that it's an uphill battle every step of the way. And I wonder if this in some ways connects to Jonathan Birtwell, your question also here in the Q&A of what we can learn from young people who are self-organizing some of their resistance to this or organizing different types of learning. And I do think there are important lessons in that for thinking about how young people are creating the spaces to learn what they think is important to learn, often as a companion to whatever the formal education is. So sometimes that's through drama troops, sometimes that's through independent study groups, sometimes that's through transnational networks that happen over Facebook or over WhatsApp, and sharing that kind of learning. But I think where we hear from young people the lack of hopefulness arises is that is all well and fine to do that kind of learning, but then when you consistently confront the legal barrier or the political barrier to participation to work and feel like you have no control over those kinds of decisions, that's where it starts to feel much less hopeful, and where we see, I think, that rise of pessimism in that way. So I think that actually there's a lot more hope within the small scale, very local kinds of initiatives, and than there is within kind of global approaches and a lot of the humanitarian kind of interventions that by nature are short-lived and I think do continue to fall into this trap of not a long-term thinking that focuses on the future, and whose interests are tied to political agendas, no matter how apolitical the mandate is. And so I think that we need to support the youth who are trying to organize on these issues to really think about these global connections and what that means, but also the more local action in their context. So I realize that's somewhat of a kind of non-answer, that I do think that it is important to continue maintaining this kind of hope and looking for the examples where we see some progress and some movement on engaging in these political ways in refugee education. But I think it is going to be one of these continual challenges that we face over decades.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, it's a big challenge, and I'm going to move to Brian. Brian, would you like to ask your question in person? I always feel it's nicer to hear it from the people themselves rather than us reading it out. Brian, if you'd like to ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm in Beirut at the moment, and the Wi-Fi is not great. Hi, Sarah. So just picking up on some of the things that you've just talked about, and particularly what resonated with me was the phrase you used, the false promise. So when you've been speaking with the participants that you've been working with over so many years, how do you find that the learners themselves and their families, how do they balance their own awareness of the restrictions that they face in their lived realities with what is hopefully the inherent optimism or promise of engaging in education? Because so many people are setting out on a journey with an education that on certain levels they know will actually not necessarily lead to the promised gains that you would normally expect. And kind of following on from that, my second question is, how do you think that fits with either implicitly or explicitly the overarching principle for NGOs of doing no harm in the work that they're doing? Because they also have awareness in this space as well.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Brian, for these questions. I do find that this is perhaps one of these kind of ongoing puzzles that that in terms of the dissonance between kind of what we know are the roadblocks to young people kind of using their education for the purposes, and I don't just only mean for jobs, but for other kinds of engagement in society and contributing, and the continued belief that education is going to lead to some kind of future opportunities. And again, I don't think that this is unique to refugees, but we certainly see it among refugee populations, is this ongoing belief. And I think particularly in situations where it's hard to know what else one can invest in to try to create those opportunities for the future. And so not investing in education and giving up on education feels almost like a worse case scenario, even if one knows that the outcomes from that education may be limited. And so I think that that's both the kind of disconnect, but also the hopeful part that means that each of us who work in this field, and every educator and NGO worker and global agency worker, has that much more of a responsibility to act on this idea that education actually must be of substance and must build these kinds of opportunities. And I think that connects to this idea of do no harm that you raised. And one of the things that I've been really interested by in a paper that Iba Salem and I recently wrote on educators in Jordan is this process of Jordanian teachers really learning from their Syrian students about the kinds of harm that they were experiencing in education, and all different kinds of harm, but including this kind of false promise of education, and what that meant to the educators to not learn about these ideas in the abstract and in terms of kind of political rhetoric or national kind of conversations about whether or not refugees were welcome or should have certain kinds of rights, but in the context of students who they had come to deeply care about. And the ways in which teachers themselves were beginning to shift their political ideas about what might be possible in terms of the kinds of rights and experiences that refugees might have through these relationships. And I think, in fact, is this kind of operationalizing of this kind of do no harm principle, where individuals are all of a sudden confronted with the fact that their practices are doing harm. And so what do we then need to take from that and learn from that for future actions? And I guess this speaks back also to this kind of the value of individual interactions and relationships and narrative, if one is not in a position to have those interactions firsthand. And that I don't think that we can overestimate the importance of that kind of contact and ongoing dialogue, and creating more conditions for that, whether it's those working with NGOs or UN agencies or children in schools who may be separated for all different kinds of reasons, to really continue to try to foster those interactions to create more change over time.
Thanks, Sarah. We have 3 more minutes. I have many questions that I would have loved to ask you, and hopefully we'll have another chance to talk. One of the things that I would like us is to do in the last 3 minutes, if we step back into the field and the research and the knowledge production in this field. I mean, both of us in a position of privilege. I mean, you're in Harvard, I'm at the moment in Cambridge, and the kind of, reading your book, there are lots of, many of the people you quoted are scholars from the global north, who are based in the global north. And I often wonder what kind of knowledge can emerge by the scholars from the global south who have very limited resources. I mean, we have the privilege of maybe applying to some big grants and researching, being dedicated for 15 years to this. But this is affecting the kind of scholarship, and it's also affecting the kind of voices that can influence and put pressure in different places. So I'm just wondering, and I know you have the Reach network or center, so I'm wondering about how do you envision we could address some of these inequalities within the knowledge production cycle in this field?
Yeah, I wish we had more than 2 minutes for this, because I think this is, to me, this is also this kind of quintessential question if we're really serious about building the future of this field, and not only continuing with the kind of status quo in research, as you've described, Maha. And I think it really demands that each of us who work in this field really think both about our own individual actions and work, where we do work, how we think about collaborations, how we think about the kind of knowledge that we're seeking to generate and whether or not I am the right person to do that research. And I think it also really, I hope, creates more space for the kinds of collaboration where we do look across borders and think about the kind of privileges that those who have the ability to move across borders have taken advantage of for long periods of time. I'm constantly surprised in interactions with teachers, for example, when I do research in classrooms and we're thinking about the ways in which I might kind of contribute to their work or think with them about something kind of productive that the research might contribute to. And without fail, what teachers want to know is what goes on in other classrooms that may be in the same city or in a different country, but teachers facing similar kinds of questions in their own teaching. And I feel like the walls that we've created around this kind of knowledge sharing are just constantly visible to me in that place. And the privilege that I have to move between the classrooms when really those teachers are the ones who need to be moving between those classrooms and being able to share that kind of knowledge and build it in that way. So I hope that we can in some ways have a very multifaceted approach that I hope does include a large tent of who's involved in really thinking about this, but addressing, as I talked about in my talk, both the resource and the identity-based inequalities that continue to perpetuate some of the gaps, I think, in our field that are detrimental to all.
Thank you, Sarah. I mean, we could stay here forever. So Masa's asking where we can find the book. Is it available online, Sarah?
Sure. So there is an ebook that is available online, and then it's also available through Harvard University Press in the US and in the UK. I'm happy to share with Maha, if that's helpful for other kinds of communications to those who were here, different ways to access it. And we also have a series of recordings. Maha was part of one of them, of conversations on the book with 9 different people that kind of address different aspects of the book that are available freely on our Reach website, if that's of interest.
Thank you, Sarah. And so the recording will be available on our website. Just give us maybe a week until the comms team is able to upload it there, but it's also available on our Facebook page, Lebanese Studies Facebook page, where you can listen to it. Thank you very much, Sarah, for this, I feel like we're just beginning to delve into the topic, and there's a wealth of findings and issues to unpack. And thank you for all the participants who have attended and for all the amazing questions. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Keep well.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.